just introduce Jeff Livingstone. He's going to take it from there with our panel this morning. And we so appreciate the sponsorship of Tech Mahindra and their folks being here. Jeff is the Associate Vice President for Healthcare and Life Sciences at Tech Mahindra. He's a principal consultant for Global Healthcare and Life Sciences Division, focusing on managing key projects in R&D, clinical research, compliance, and info security. Earlier, he was the he's had quite an bioinformatics career at Pegasystems, Akamai, and Cybermedica clinical research platforms. He has a PhD in physical biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Jeff.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Am I coming through? Okay, good. So we decided to do things a little bit differently. Rather than PowerPoint you to death, basically, we wanted to have more a sort of a fireside type of discussion. So what I've asked the panelists to do today is to impart to you some of the things they're seeing out there that possibly people are seeing maybe bits and pieces of, but maybe not the entire picture. So what we're going to try to do is present from very different points of view in very different parts of our industry some of the things that we're working on, we're seeing, and then at the end try to put it all together and ask for some interesting questions, maybe some dialogue between us and the audience. But we're relatively small today. We want to keep it relatively informal. Okay? So I'll take the first shot. So at Tech Mahindra, one of the things that we have a great advantage of is seeing into other industries. And pharma in general and diagnostics specifically has really been more or less a sort of a very siloed type of industry. But now with some of the pressures, the market pressures in the industry, what we're seeing is that they are more and more looking outward into other industries for solutions, and primarily data solutions, because pharmaceutical development used to be a activity of chemistry. It's really not true anymore. It's really more or less of an activity of information and data management. That's becoming more and more true. So this topic in particular is quite timely. And just from my purview, a couple of things that we're seeing here is two areas we're seeing a lot of interest in. We've seen historically in the past a great deal of application in big data analytics, visualization, etc., to things like sales and marketing campaigns, supply chain management, where are things going. What we're starting to see now is in a couple of very interesting and unique areas that start to branch outside of pharma and touch other points in the healthcare ecosystem. And the first one is in portfolio management. So classically in, say, the pharmaceutical company, you have people that work in both development as well as in finance that try to build these portfolios of drug programs. And what they like to do, their intention is to try to predict success and failure as best as they can. So if you are tasked with building out a, say, 5 or 10-year plan where to make your investments, what you typically try to do is try to aggregate as much historical information about those particular types of programs. That's actually very difficult to do inside a pharmaceutical company, typically. You typically don't see into the existing drug development practices and activities. You typically have to rely on a lot of old database information. And the kinds of valuation algorithms that are being applied are very much limited by your inputs. So what's happening now is the companies and the groups that run these sort of portfolio assessments are trying to see into the current stage of research. The ideal state is to actually have in real time, again, this is an ideal state, it is not yet achieved, to have in real time analytics that come back from essentially the bedside or the bench to tell you success or failure as drugs go through the development process, first in the research and then in early stage clinical. So we're seeing the interest in groups that typically sat, if not miles away on the same campus in different countries altogether, coming together to work together in this very collaborative way. And so they're trying to pull together historical financial data, market data, demographic data, where certain classes of drugs actually sold, together with early phase research results, adverse event reporting, different indications, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really become an extremely multi-dimensional type of assessment. So you can imagine the wealth and number of different types of information that they're trying to pull together, slice and dice, this kind of thing. It's something that the groups in the financial parts of these companies have not done before. It's very alien to them, particularly when looking at, say, like clinical data. What is this? These are numbers guys, for lack of a better term. So what the role that we're playing is primarily two-part. One is to tie these different systems together in ways that allow them to access the information in as real time as possible. And the second is to provide some sort of consultative types of services on how would you actually go about analyzing these kinds of very, very different types of data. And what we're able to do is we're able to pull our learnings, our experiences from different industries like manufacturing, automotive, electronics, that have pretty much done this already in an analogous fashion. Pull it together and use that as a model upon which to base these systems that we're now building or helping to build in a consultative fashion inside the pharma companies. So that's one area that we're seeing that is definitely an unmet need and very much growing. The second piece, or the second area, is now this is far upstream, now far downstream, connecting to the patient. What you'd like to do ideally is you'd like to actually, again, in as real time as possible, when you're conducting early stage trials, is you'd like to actually have information coming back from the patient in as real time as possible. So with the advent of a lot of these monitors, these sensors that people are building, and we actually have a separate an engineering group internally that actually builds biosensors, which then are applied to patients and monitor them inside hospitals, inside clinics, or even remotely from home. You want to tie all that information together into the data systems and port that data back into the big aggregate that then can be analyzed in real time. So you can imagine that when you have the kinds of pressures on trials which once were large centers conducting large trials or large hospitals, now becoming this massive portfolio of disparate places all over the globe with small clinics or small places, wherever you can find the population that meets the genetics that you're looking for effectively, right? So you have all of these different data sources that are all coming together, including, of course, the genetic data, et cetera, physiological data, all these other types of different characteristics, attributes on the patients themselves. And all of that is now coming together in real time and being analyzed in a big data sort of fashion. So that's another, what we see as emerging trend. So the very front end, portfolio analysis, the very back end, the connection with the device to get the information from the bedside, bringing it back to the researcher, the clinical evaluators, to actually make adaptive decisions on whether they're going to continue or not continue a trial or actually amend a particular protocol. So if you have that kind of activity coming back to you in as real time as possible, it makes the ability to do this kind of adaptive decision making much better, much easier. It's something that, again, the companies would like to do to eliminate the costs, make their clinical trials more efficient, their research in general more efficient. Hasn't really happened yet, but this kind of connectivity to these big data systems possibly will allow that to happen in the future. So again, these are front end, back end, these are the two sort of big trends that we see from our point of view as Tech Mahindra. So with that, I'll stop.
Okay. So I actually did prepare slides, but I can wing it. It's not a problem.
You can show them if you want.
That's okay. So I wanted to start by talking about my foot, because everyone asks me what's going on with my foot. So
show them your foot.
Oh, yeah. So I have this big air cast on. It's pretty cool, actually. I can walk with it. It's not a real, full-out cast. But what I found was there's an old adage, step on a crack, break your mother's back. What's that? What's that?
Oh, yeah.
I will. Okay, I'll get to it. And there's a corollary to that adage, and that is step in a hole, break your father's fifth metatarsal. So my name's Rishi Khan. I work for a small company called Extreme Scale Solutions, and we work at the interface between high-performance computing and big data, or what people call big data. I like to call it data-intensive, data-intensive computation. And so what you see is there's been a. Can I turn down the volume a little? Is it too loud, or is that okay? All right, cool. There's been these two magistra of fields. There's been the standard HPC, which has really been around simulation and modeling, and this other field of data analysis, which has been around statistics and possibly databases and whatnot. And what we're seeing is a convergence between the two. And what lies at the intersection of those two is large, distributed, compute-intensive data analytics. And so that's where my company focuses. And what we try to do is bridge this gap between people who fiddle around with Excel spreadsheets and try to find something, and people who can employ, a multi-million-dollar data science team with large data sets. Those are the two spectrums, and what's left in the middle is people who'd like to get more out of their data, but just simply don't have the resources or the know-how to do it, and the infrastructure to do it. So what we're working on providing is a software as a service cloud solution, which you can upload data sets, and it will automatically determine the types of data that you're looking at and slice and dice those data in different ways and tell you, here are the statistically significant claims that we were able to come up with based on looking at your data. And that could be used to have data scientists leverage that and go further, or it could be used to just go and use. So like, for example, you want to know, what is it about the top 10% of my customers that makes them keep buying my stuff? How do I get them to buy more stuff? Or maybe how do I keep the people who never pay me from ever visiting my site or ever interacting with me? Those types of questions you can ask. So I give one simple example. We ran the MLB 2012 statistics through the system, and everybody knows the home team has an advantage, right? It's about a 5.6% lead, all other things being equal. Well, it turns out that if a game lasts for less than 180 minutes, they have a very large advantage, and if a game lasts more than 180 minutes, the away team has about a 14% edge. So that's the kind of stuff that you can pull out of data when you slice it in different ways, whereas if you just looked at it as a whole, you wouldn't even see that kind of thing. So now let me talk about big data and pharma a little bit. So first of all, I do a lot of stuff with big data. I do a lot of stuff with high-performance computing. I do very little with pharma. I do have a background in computational biology with my PhD, but what I did is I went and talked to a bunch of people in pharma about what they're doing with their data and where the problems are. And the first thing I learned is that there's this saying from Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
That's right.
So when I classify what is big data, people say it's volume, variety, and velocity. And a lot of this data, at least today, is very low velocity. The volume fits on my hard drive, maybe even fits on my phone, right? The only thing it really has is variety. There's lots of biological variety. So a lot of the problems that you face are really around bringing the data together in a coherent way and having a data model that allows you to bring these pieces of data together to do some analysis. Not so much that you need a petabyte of RAM or an exabyte of hard drive space to be able to hold this stuff, like the banking industry needs, or possibly like Google or Facebook need to deal with all of their data. So it's a fundamentally different problem than what you see in the rest of the big data stuff. So I think that's something that needs to be taken away when you look at what kind of solutions you want. So most people say big data, oh, that's Hadoop, that's Cassandra, but you need to understand that their fundamental assumptions are you're going to be scaling this out to 10,000 machines on unreliable hardware, and you need to get solutions in a certain time frame. That's not really the case. So you need to understand what exactly is your problem that you want to solve, what kind of assumptions are you making, and then build your tools and understand your tools from there. So the second thing that when I talk to people, one of the big problems is, as everyone knows, is these data silos. But there's some fundamental reasons why there are data silos. One of them is that the software that people use to analyze stuff right now, it's difficult to analyze it remotely. So what a lot of people do is they say, oh, I need that gigabyte of data. Let me bring it to my hard drive. And now I'm going to analyze it, and I figure something out. And I write a paper, or maybe I do a report, and then that's it. And then it doesn't go back to the original source, or is there even an original source? Is there a place that's a central location? It doesn't really make it back because people do work in a distributed way. The second problem is there's governmental regulations on who and what can do work. If this has been fixed recently, but for a long time, maybe up until like 2006, 2007, you do a clinical trial, you get a HIPAA waiver, and it says you're able to use this data for studying in this clinical trial, right? And now, but now I want to do a cross-clinical trial study and understand some bigger effect. I can't do that because I don't have a waiver from those people that says that I'm able to do that. This is kind of the same problem they had in the mortgage industry with these tranches where they would sell pieces of things to everybody, and now you can't unwind that because you don't even know who owns what and who's in charge of what, and where do you get the paperwork to sign all that? So I think that's being solved today, but it's still a problem that's out there. So whenever you're collecting data, you need to make sure that you're within the regulations to do what it is you want to do with that data down the future. You got to future-proof your analysis. Another issue is I think it's regulations in countries have to change. So for example, in Germany, if you collect data about German patients in Germany, the data has to stay in Germany.
That's correct.
Right, so how are you going to bring that together? How are you going to do that if 3 other countries say that? You can't bring that data together. So that's something that has to happen at an international regulation level. Another problem is when you do an analysis, or when you start collecting data, you have a question in mind. And typically what people do is they collect the data to answer their question. And then 5 years down the road, you say, man, I got a new question. Let me see if I can take all this data and put it together. And all of a sudden, you can't answer that question because you didn't collect the data to answer this new question. So before you start collecting data, you need to start thinking about how can I future-proof my question asking ability? What are all of the different things that I might want to ask in the future? And obviously, it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be iterative. But you have to think in that way instead of saying, I want X. How's the cheapest way I can get that done right now?
So you're basically saying you have to know what you want to know before you want to know it.
That's right. Well, you have to know what you want to ask at least.
I know.
Yeah. That's right. So that's another issue that you have to deal with. Another one is at the intersection of these data sets, this goes back to the first one really, is that people collect different fields for values for different data, and then you want to do a cross clinical study or a cross data study, and the fields don't line up, right?
That's correct.
I collected on this trial over here, I collected at time points 1 hour, 3 days, and 7 days. But over here I did 10 days and 20 days. Well, they don't. I can't bring those two data sets together. Maybe I can do a longer time series analysis, but I can't get more statistical power out of what I've done. Another example is a lot of times you collect weird subpopulations. Like I'm looking at these type of people for this obesity drug, but maybe I have a whole bunch of heart rate data that I want to be able to understand how heart rate and sodium intake have some correlations or some effects. And now I have another data set over here that is, people who have Alzheimer's. Well, your data is your populations are so stratified that it's difficult to reduce those confounding factors. So you need to think about your populations that you're bringing in when you collect this data, which is back to the same question of what do you want to ask in the future? How do you collect that data? And the final thing I wanted to talk about is the cloud. So people say, well, why don't you throw this in the cloud? Why don't we just put the data in the cloud and get the data from the cloud and everything will be great? Well, I see a few problems with that. I think that's a great idea. But one of the biggest problems that I think Tom is going to talk about is how do you ensure the people who are allowed to access that data have access to it, the people who aren't allowed to access it don't, and that the data that you're using you're using it for the right purposes. This is a bigger problem. So like
Yes.
back to the HIPAA thing, I have this data set, I'm allowed to do it for X, and now I have another data set and I'm allowed to use it for Y. I'm not allowed to do X plus Y. How do you enforce that? What's the metadata you need to put around these data sets to enforce that you're in compliance with the regulations and what permissions you actually have on your data? Another big problem is security in the cloud. If you look at a lot of these Hadoop systems or whatever, the fundamental assumption is everybody can access any of the data anytime. Now, they're working on putting ACLs in and stuff like that, but it's got a ways to go. And the third thing is back to this government problem where the data has to live somewhere, and you can't just move it from place to place and move it around. Otherwise, I think the cloud is great, but I see these are major obstacles to getting to the cloud. So solutions to those problems, or some beginning solutions. One is think about your problems that you want to ask in the future and how these data sets might mesh together before you start collecting the data. A second is make sure that you have all the permissions you need to do what you think you're going to do down the road. And the third is work with these governments and regulatory agencies to explain to them, this is the power of what I would be able to do if you gave me the rights to do this. And here are the laws or the regulations that are impeding me from doing that. Another thing that could be useful is if the pharma companies came together as consortia and built these standards and built these lobbying efforts to show this is where we need to go. So and so that's what I have to say about data analysis in big pharma. I don't have much to say about big data in big pharma because I don't really see much big data. But the reason I'm here today is I want to know how I can help you guys in doing better data analysis. So if you guys have any questions or if you want to talk about things, I'd love to answer anything on the panel. But I really want to know, what are your use cases? How can I help you guys do a better job analyzing your data and getting results, preferably in a most automated fashion? Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Molly Shields-Ewing with Safe Biopharma. Safe is signatures and authentication for everyone. I think I'm going to take us back up to a 30,000-foot level for just a minute, and that is, there is a revolution that has been going on over the past couple of decades in medical science and technology. It is unprecedented in history what is in the labs today and the kinds of breakthroughs in terms of treatments that have occurred, are now in the labs, and will soon come out of them. Big data certainly holds the potential to drive these frontiers even further and another great leap forward. And there are many initiatives underway that really are targeted at big data in order to provide policymakers and R&D, business decision makers, and others, certainly healthcare providers, the information they need to improve the quality of the delivery of medicines and healthcare to patients. So I'll give you an example. The Medicare Modernization Act, which was passed right before the Obamacare, is targeted at taking all of the information out of Medicare and Medicaid patients, aggregating it, and then making it public. So there will be literally head-to-head information on doctors, on hospitals, on treatments, on drugs in the same class, on implants, all kinds of things. And as we move forward in the implementation of Obamacare and all the health information technology infrastructure underpinning it, the fundamental purpose of that, or one of the fundamental purposes, is to take all of this data, aggregate it, and give policymakers and decision makers the information they need to provide better health care. And certainly from the pharmaceutical point of view, to make decisions around drugs and treatments earlier and better. So today, that's one sort of example. Another is you're seeing the beginnings of this. Transcelerate, I think many of you are familiar with Transcelerate. It's a new coalition of 18 pharmaceutical companies that are trying to do some collaboration in 5 different areas. One of them, they are also currently looking at, they've partnered with Medidata, and they are looking at data from 5 years, 7,000 clinical trials, 120 different sponsors to try and see if the source document validation has an impact on site development and quality. Again, leveraging big data, data from lots of different partners. IBM's Watson touts that it has a 90% success rate in diagnosing certain cancers, whereas in a head-to-head trial against doctors were only 50%, had a 50% success rate, and that was because Watson can take information about a patient, lots of information, and compare it with literally hundreds of thousands or millions of data points from other patients with similar diagnoses. So again, it's here, it's beginning, it holds tremendous potential. But in order to leverage this capability, and I think we've heard this theme throughout, we need the infrastructure, we need the ecosystem, and the tools to bring the promise to fruition. And we need 21st century tools. Today, in terms of identity management and access, we have what Gartner calls a 19th century industrial approach. And that is everyone else owns an identity on the internet. So if you sign on to Facebook, if you sign on to Target, if you sign on to anybody, they have your identity. And you have to, as an individual, you have to manage that identity. There may be identity proofing behind it. It may be a trusted identity, or it may simply be an email address that you could be anybody. So one of the things that we need as we move forward, and Rishi touched on this, is we need trust that the person you're dealing with is who he or she says he is. We need to make sure that they have the business processes around that. So for example, a signature that is legally enforceable, that meets regulatory requirements, and that has a governance and change management mechanism within it. So about not quite 10 years ago, the big pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Merck, GlaxoSmithKline, J&J, AstraZeneca, Sanofi, established Signatures and Authentication for Everyone. It's a nonprofit industry collaboration to establish a trusted identity standard, which would provide the risk mitigation, the legal requirements, the regulatory requirements, would meet US and EU regulatory requirements as well as legal requirements. So today, Safe Biopharma Association, which is really a collaboration of 35 different companies, manages two trust standards. One is for authentication, which is that you can trust this person, that they are who they say they are. And the second is a digital signature standard, which uniquely links that person's identity to their signature. And the signature is non-repudiable, which means you can't say you didn't mean to make that signature. It is persistent. You can store it for 100 years, and it maintains document integrity. And that is, if someone goes in and changes the document after it's been signed, the signature is invalidated. So the document has been tampered with. The FDA and the EMA participated in the creation of this standard, and today the FDA has accepted millions of SafeSign submissions. The European Medicines Agency requires digital signatures on electronic submissions, and it is in the process now of enabling its forms for digital signature submission. Excuse me. So today, the use of the Safe Biopharma digital identity and signatures are heavily for electronic lab notebooks and other discovery notebooks, for clinical trial protocols, for access to clinical portals, for signing regulatory and other clinical documents, for contracts and other workflow improvement, as well as for business process improvement through workflow applications. It's also, we're seeing great use in terms of electronic prescribing, particularly electronic prescribing for controlled substances, and then of course access to electronic health records in the health space. Where SAFE as a community is now, the ecosystem has been created. We have commercial providers of identities. We're seeing a lot of applications being SAFE enabled. But the real promise and where we see the greatest growing use is in the collaboration space, similar to what ExoStar is doing in Federation. So you can trust a Merck identity because it meets certain standards. You can trust a Pfizer identity because it does. And then for third parties, you can use Safe Biopharma compliant identities. So what you do is you federate an identity. A person can carry this identity with him or her across the entire healthcare sector. So I think that really if we are going to reduce the cost, speed cycle time, and certainly improve business process, we really need to move to these standards and to implement them. I mean, currently the burden on investigators and on individuals participating in the system, particularly as the industry grows through collaboration, is extraordinarily burdensome. And so I think we need not only to improve the IT infrastructures and the way we manage data, but we need to improve the tools around it. And fundamental is a single identity, a passport, a driver's license for the internet. So, thank you.
I have a.
Sure.
Do you mind if I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Sure.
So there's a standard that's out there called OpenID.
Yes.
That's being used in a lot of different places. You can log in using your OpenID.
Yes.
How is safe? What is safety that's different?
Okay, so OpenID, all right, so in the trust world, there are different standards of trust, and the National Institute of Standards has developed a system of 1, 2, 3, 4 to determine if it's low trust, that's a level 1, which is OpenID. There's level 2, which is more information, more trust around a person. Level 3, which requires two-factor, which is generally what is required for access to financial information, for access to clinical trial information. And there's level 4, which is really a DoD level in certainly the commercial world, a Department of Defense level. So from level 1, OpenID, very low trust, to level 4, extraordinarily high trust involving a biometric.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
So an OpenID,
It's just a
is-
password. It's like
yeah,
a username
right.
and a password.
It's not strong enough to provide access to really sensitive data.
Right.
Certainly not PI, personally identifiable information. Okay, so SAFE, actually we maintain 2 trust frameworks. One is for authentication, and we certify providers at levels 1, 2, and 3. And so we have one company certified at level 1, Cegedim, which maintains a database of about 7 million healthcare professionals. But they are moving that up to level 2, and then eventually they will move it up to level 3. And most of the others are level 3. To do a digital signature, you must have a level 3. And so the second trust framework is really an encryption type of framework that involves level 3 only.
Okay, so I think I'm next. I'm Tom Johnson from ExoStar, and it's been interesting to me as we kind of talked about building this panel and how do we tell the story as we go through. ExoStar is really about enabling this framework and how do I make those tools available to the science community, to the large pharma companies, to the universities, and make that a secure, collaborative environment. I'm going to buck the trend a little bit, Jeff, and use the 4 slides that I put together. But I think they'll tie back pretty nicely as we go through the story and hopefully paint the picture of how do we start to put these tools and framework together. This slide just gives you a little bit of background of who we work with on a regular basis from ExoStar standpoint. And as Jeff talked about Tech Mahindra's experience with other industries and kind of bringing some of that experience into the life science challenges and how do they help you, that's our heritage as well. So ExoStar started with aerospace and defense. We run a very large identity hub and collaboration network for aerospace and defense. 100,000 different organizations, several 100,000 users, and we provide credentials like the SAFE credentials that are PKI certified, cross-certified with the Federal Bridge for DoD access or other commercial uses. In the last 3 to 4 years, we've moved into life sciences and kind of from an invitation that said this is a good fit for your solutions, and as we looked at it from a compliance standpoint and enabling the right services, we felt we could help with the business problems that were here. So you'll see a couple big players in Merck and AstraZeneca that are using our services today, and there's 500 other organizations that are part of the environment. So I don't have a clicker, but I'm going to ask that we click into the next few slides. And go ahead and please build this all the way through. This was just really kind of summarizing the story that we just heard. So you've got the big data challenge, and how do I make that big data available from a collaboration standpoint? All right, here we go. Just the middle button?
That's the mouse. I think it's the bottom button.
Bottom button.
Is that working? It's changing the volume.
No.
Oh, that's the volume the other way.
Left, right.
There we go. There you go. There you go.
Did I get one?
Yeah.
Uh-oh. No, I didn't.
Yeah.
Oh, just hit the forward button. Okay, so this was just kind of summarizing the things that we just talked about. But the key points here, in order to get that access to the big data, you have to address the security and what are the right protocols, some of those being identity and access management, the collaboration aspects, how do I make this affordable in what I'm doing, how do I provide the right access, and most important, and trying to get to that end value prop of speeding the research, connecting the right people at the right time, is that usability, and how do we make this usable and available to the community. So a good friend gave me this quote as we talk about if I asked what people wanted, they would tell me they wanted a faster horse, from Henry Ford. And I think the relevancy here from an ExoStar standpoint, if we went out into the industry, and we see this a lot day in and day out, each one of the large pharma companies or large companies in aerospace look at the different business challenges and they try to solve them from an individual standpoint. And how am I going to make things happen faster? And how do I do user federation or get all of my internal employees single sign-on to these different solutions? And from an ExoStar standpoint, as we were formed in aerospace by a consortium, our focus has always been, how do I make this better for the community? How do I solve the problems across the community, not at the individual enterprise level? So if we look into a little bit of the story, and I'll just kind of paint the story here from a tool standpoint, and this is it from the PowerPoint. If I start with a large pharma, and they have research and information that they want to work with, and they want to work with some tool providers for that. We heard yesterday in Bob's keynote, he talked about Liaison. We work with them, we work with BT, also Microsoft, in making some of these big data and research environments available, right? And when we talk with these partners, it's about how do they put their services out in the cloud and make them available to the identities, to the community that needs access to them quickly. So it needs to be ready infrastructure. It needs to be something you can take advantage of in a very quick manner. And so how do I do that? How do I make that work from a user standpoint? Well, I need to get the federation in place so that I can get that quick access. So from a Merck standpoint, they're connected to the Secure Access Manager. They do that with federation into the hub, and then we broker that and provide them access into the tools that they're using. So from a user standpoint, they come in to do research with BT or with Liaison tools. They click into those services, and they simply get access because that trust framework that Molly was talking about, based on the SAFE certification, is in place, and that authentication gets passed technically in the background. So a usability, I just click and I get access, and that's what I want to know. I just logged into my Merck environment in the morning. We are a SAFE certified environment and working through an additional step up in the way that we work with SAFE today to be a full trust framework certification as well. So the next piece would be, how do I get my partners in? And so as we've built and continue to grow this environment, it's where do I get the CROs? So Charles River, AMRI, Covance, and a handful of others are connected in that federated way. Same experience. They come and work with Merck in the BT environment. They'll click on those and they get a single sign-on experience to get to it. They're off and running very quickly. Those folks that aren't ready to do that federation or the technical background, they get a credential that's issued by ExoStar, that aligns with those safe qualifications, so they can come and use the services as well and authenticate. When they click into the BT or the Liaison or Microsoft environment, they're going to be prompted for a login, and they'll log into the service at that point in time, and it'll give them access to all of those services that they have attached to the Community Hub. Some of those services could be sensitive. So as Molly talked about, those different tiers, today if I click into a service that is deemed by the service provider as a level 3 requirement, that NIST level 3, I'm going to challenge them in the service to step up and provide that second factor of authentication. So I only get challenged for that when I start to hit that sensitive data. Again, focusing on that usability. I want to get the right level of challenge at the right time. I don't want to make you do that every single time that you access the service. And in addition to those research items, I may want to just do some general collaboration. So I want to do discussion around the research. I may want to extract reports from that research that I'm doing and share that with the team and do that. So in that case, there's community cloud tools that I can make available. It might be a Merck-specific tool, like we support their Engage Zone, or a general environment that's our secure share to share collaborative information with your teams. Or it could be lots of other service providers that we're connecting to the overall service framework. And in the end, when we paint the whole picture and where we're at today, there's lots of different services. The important part is each one of these services that I can come from a community standpoint, I can get to with that single credential. I don't have to juggle a bunch of different passwords. I don't have to juggle a lot of different information. I can come with that single credential to get to those services. And what does that really mean from a value prop? It means with the Merck teams that we work with day in and day out, when they invited or identified a new research opportunity to share information, they used to go through and get those researchers' IDs in their internal networks. And as they went through that internal network process to fill out the request and go through the review, it might have taken them on average 6 weeks to get that access, as well as get the services stood up. And by creating these things as a community, the SLA we have today is 5 days for that, and the average is 3 days. So a brand new research problem comes up with a new partner, the tools are in place so they can invite that partner to get credentials and get access, the environment gets stood up, and they're sharing information in 3 days, and that's actual numbers. So it's a great use case and example to say, what do we want to do to kind of change the view? This is an enterprise focus, this is community, and making these tools available across the community to do the big data research and make those tools available to follow the standards that are out here and solve some of the problems that we heard from Jeff. How do we put those pieces together? And our vision and focus is, the tool sets here. We've got Transcelerate, as Molly mentioned. They're using the Secure Access Manager as their access point, and they'll use our credentials as well to get into those clinical trial services and at the investigator registrations that they're offering in the next 12 months or so. Office 365, Google, other cloud providers from an access standpoint. But this important part as well is following around with the loop here from the SAM. I don't know if I have a laser on this. Oops. Oh, let me go back. So just from the SAM ID that comes out of the Secure Access Manager, you see the line.
The top button.
Top button. Oh, the plus. There we go. If I start here and I come around, so I can use that same ID, that same credential, to actually get into services that are hosted by your big partners, right? So AstraZeneca has their NextDocs eTMF attached to the service. And if I'm coming from one of the universities that works with them, I'm using that same credential to get into those back-end services. So we're talking about just how do we enable the science, how do we enable the right tools at the right time. It's using some of these standards, it's providing this community framework to share that information. So I think that, Jeff, that's kind of where I ended. And
I just wanted to make a comment on this. I mean, this is a really complex graph with the word security in it, and complexity and security typically don't go hand in hand. So the thing that I would say is that security in general keeps good people from doing bad things, but don't trust this too much. Like for example, your safe sign. You have a document, the way they typically do it is they sign it with an MD5 hash or an SHA1 hash. There's been mathematical proofs that you can build collisions where the same hash matches, I signed it, I have a document, I can change the document in a certain way, and then typically what they have to do is they have to add some garbage at the end of it, like a bunch of bytes of just random stuff, and get exactly the same hash back. So currently, MD5 is known to be broken, SHA0 is broken, SHA1 is close, they haven't broken it yet, and they're thinking that the only thing they have right now are the elliptic curve stuff.
Right,
So,
I believe our infrastructures are SHA2.
okay, well, still, I mean, the SHA2, it's a matter of time, right? It's an arms race. It's not an endpoint. It's not my stuff is secure. My stuff is it's an arms race.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And from our perspective, one of the things that we do in creating the Secure Access Manager and the rule set that we're applying is the governance is provided by the community. So in our governance council that says, these are the problems I'm trying to solve, these are the compliance risks, this is what we see as threats. We meet with them on a regular basis from the participating companies. We look at those real world problems, look at what are the current solutions that are out there, and say, does this make sense? How do we enable the business that needs to happen? And those are the things that drive our roadmap. They drive our partner roadmaps that are out there providing the services as well. How do we address those? But you're right, it's going to be an ever-evolving challenge, and how do we meet those?
And you just have to at any point say, understand that it's as secure as I can make it now. That doesn't mean that nobody can get to this data, right? If you work with the NSA, they actually have the first level of security is physical security. You connect that thing up to the internet and boom, now a guy in Korea can access your system, right? Maybe he can't break everything, but he can start playing with it, right? So at the NSA, they actually physically have machines these machines connect to the internet, they go and get something, and then they put it on a disk and walk over here and do something with it.
The air gap,
absolutely.
So I would just make one comment, and that is certainly true. Your point about, you always have to stay one step ahead of the hackers. But the fact of the matter is, most people are accessing sensitive data using a username and password, which is like nothing.
Oh, I agree.
Absolutely like nothing. So this is light years.
Yeah, I agree.
Light years more secure than what is common practice today.
Right. And also the other thing is the human side of this. So they can go and they can access this data over here, but then they store it on their laptop.
Sure.
Right? And okay, now there's no security. Now I leave my laptop in the back of a cab. Right, so.
Right, and so as you look at roadmap and what are the rights management things you can do around the data sets and how to protect it, encrypt it, and do some things for real time. When I try to access that data from anywhere, it goes out to a policy service, authenticates you, and won't open until you have that. So it's an ever-evolving set of tools.
Right.
The most important, again, from that second slide that I had in the lower left was usability. So we can make it more and more secure, as you said, but if I can't do the work that I need to do, then I really get no value out of that. So I've got to balance the usability, find the right tools, and get an acceptable level of protection so that I can manage that risk and do the business.
Right.
That's a difficult trade-off. In the healthcare arena today, they've erred on the side of user friendliness. And I think if any of you have read about the number of breaches, I mean, there are just millions of them.
Right.
And so they're having to move to provide more security around access to patient information, access to patient health records, et cetera. So I mean, that's a friction I think we're always going to deal with. This system is very secure. It comes out of the defense industry and the airline, the Dreamliner? Right.
Yeah. No, my point is, I agree with you completely that it's much more secure than having, a password authentication, but it's a journey. It's not an endpoint. There's no such thing as this is secure. That's my point.
If I could kind of do a little bit of segue. So interesting, some very interesting points here. And one of the things that I'm looking at is I'm going to rise up a little bit level. So as sort of a systems integrator right, a services provider perspective, I would basically be using different services and solutions provided here, packaging them together in a way for a client. Classically, that's what we would do. And so one of the things that we see interesting, this movement, in addition to the security movement, is one that uses business rules. And so business rules used to be the mainstay of, and you'll see where I'm going. Give me a second to get around the bend. So business rules used to be the mainstay of BPM, business process management, right? So you had things like Pegasystems, et cetera, right? And now what you're seeing is that the rules themselves are being embedded into the applications and into the various systems. But I haven't yet seen that so much in the security world. So when you talked about, say, one of the issues is the right person accessing that content, but in addition, is that content being used for correct purpose? Mm-hmm. You've also said, and this is something you both have pointed out, that the area of collaboration, particularly in pharma, is growing exponentially by market necessity, right? I mean, basically, we're seeing these kinds of massive, mega conglomerate collaboration projects happening more so now than ever. So the issue of who is using the data for what becomes paramount. In addition, you have these collaborations where the pharmaceutical companies are coming together to share data. You've had these open shares of clinical data that have been espoused by like GSK and others, for example, right? Astra. So the question is, how do you embed in the very data that you're accessing the rights or the rules, right, in order to make sure that correct people access and that the data is used for correct purpose, right? So I'd be interested to know what you guys think about that.
From a data that's tied back to a document paradigm, the classification of documents can drive a rule set that allows, a predefined policy on who gets access, where can they get access from, and how does that. When you start getting into big data and really a database and that access, from what we've seen, the tools aren't there at a detailed level to manage that individual access or the purpose from a data standpoint.
And also, like in a database, you can manage which tables you can access, but you can't really manage which rows of which tables.
Yes. Yes.
So you have to kind of break it down.
And if I may, so back in 2000, years ahead of his time, there was a doctor at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York, Robert Hotchkiss. And Robert Hotchkiss had a vision where you could actually take a document. He was working on protocols or IRB protocol submissions at the time. And that at a paragraph or even sentence level, you could actually assign rights. And his vision is that you would build a collaborative environment such that it would be completely online. Now, again, this is in 2000, so this is 14 years ago, an eon in IT time, right? But basically, you could actually have this entire orchestration of rules about who could access what pieces and parts of the document. And that unfortunately didn't get past its B-round funding, but interestingly enough, here we are 14 years later talking about similar types of things. So another thing which I find interesting is in the collaboration world, the question is activity versus outcomes, right? So if indeed, going back to the healthcare issue, right? So we're really defocusing on activities per se, being paid for activities, to being paid for outcomes, really more of a business mindset, right? So that's going to engender a great deal of access to historical data, retrospective data, which is somewhat like these clinical trial databases opening up, for example. An issue there is, if anybody who's here in the audience has ever actually done bench science, okay, as you know, you can read volumes of literature, but the literature, as it's published, is only as good as it is credible. So one of the questions, again, the good doctor had back in 2000, which is persistent till today, is what parts of the data that you're using in these big data schemes are actually credible? Because one of the things that was interesting is that back then, when we actually did a snapshot analysis of, say, take 100 papers and find out basically what are the credibility ratings for each one of these pieces of information that you're going to put into a large database to do slice and dice. Not all of them have the same level of credibility. So how can you build into the actual pieces of information that you're looking at some sort of credibility factor, right?
Well, when you say credibility, I'm assuming we're not talking about somebody trying to cheat the system, right? They did the best science they could, but it was just wrong, right?
Yes.
Okay. So
Sure.
one possible way of dealing with that is using time as a factor of credibility. Like if something was published in 1975 and it contradicts something that's published in 1990, then you may be able to set up a rule that says anything published later is more credible than something published before. But that still doesn't get to data collection credibility or noise and or systematic biases and stuff like that.
True, but the trend that nowadays, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, audience or panel, is it seems it's more of a socialization credibility. Basically, like if I have 100,000 followers, I'm a really credible guy, basically, and that's kind of no, I mean seriously, right? So, but everyone can be following the thing that looks great but is totally wrong. And you're still wrong, okay, right? But that's kind of the problem with this whole socialization movement. But I see the same kind of thing happening, not just in, say, popular culture, but in scientific endeavors as well, frankly. I mean, you have, yeah.
They're about 1980.
Well, what they're, yeah, please.
Problems with following papers is you build referential networks of your students, your postdocs, your collaborators.
Yes.
So referencing papers is probably the worst indicator. But another factor, going back to some of the issues, is looking at the data that you're actually aggregating. You're talking about using claims data. Claims data is absolutely inaccurate for representing anything about the patient other than reimbursement. If you ever go to the doctor and you walk out with your checkout form, you'll see there's things checked on there that you never mentioned, but the physician had to use that to justify the procedures and the tests.
Yes.
And so claims data is notorious for being bad.
Right.
We did a transplant study using the UNOS data, the United National Organ Transplant System. We started out with 1.3 million patients for kidney transplants. By the time we cleaned it, we had 90,000 patient records that we could use. So the data that's out there in terms of qualification is extremely dirty. There's been several studies that showed it's not reproducible. New data doesn't mean it's better, because new data is being pushed out to journals that aren't really reviewing it very rigorously. And then a key issue that hasn't been touched on is that you're talking about integrating clinical trial data, because that's what pharma has. Clinical trial data tells you how a patient responds to a drug. It doesn't tell you how they get sick. What you need to know for pharma development is how does a patient get sick in the first place?
Right.
Because you can't take a patient who's sick and responding to a certain drug and understand really anything other than how to improve that patient's response. And so it doesn't lead you into a more general approach. And so a lot of the technologies and issues that you're talking about are really very critical, but they're tactical, they're not strategic. And I think for pharma to really move ahead, we have to think a bit more strategically and long-term about what the issues are, not just as the Henry Ford comment said, everyone wants something faster, bigger, and more. But really, is that really what we need? It's what we can provide, but is it what we need?
So if I can make a geometric analogy, if I take basically a huge piece of paper with a bunch of different dots all over the place on it, and I can tell you, look, all these discrete points, I'll put them together, and they make a line, okay? That's basically what I'm trying to do. Because essentially the individual assessments basically are so different and distinct from each other that you can't assume that there is a linear relationship. That's basically the question, right? and these kinds of data sets. That's the problem. I mean,
but again, you're looking, so there's a big issue with readmission rates in hospitals. The big data solution is to collect all the discharge records and analyze them statistically to see what correlates at time of discharge. Time of discharge is not when you're going to anticipate someone is going to encounter a procedure that's going to require readmission. It's when they're first admitted and how they're going to be managed in the hospital.
yes.
Okay, so you need a model, not a statistical correlation. And one of the problems with big data is we're driving the analysis from statistics,
Yes.
not from modeling.
Yes.
And so we move away from causality and we move towards correlation. And that obfuscates what the problems are that can be addressed.
You might remember a company many, many years ago created by Monsanto called Sirion, if anybody was around at that time, right? That they were trying to do genetic analysis of this is a plant biology, but they were looking at different diseases specifically and trying to correlate them. And what they found was exactly that problem, basically. It's because they were actually dealing with all of the outcome information, not how the crops were managed or materials or nutrients. All that stuff was not the part of it. It was all strictly outward. And that basically shut down because they couldn't come up with any correlations. So the models that all the statistical, they had hired a zillion statistical analysis and database people that just basically came down and entrenched in Cambridge, but they didn't have the modelers to do to create the correct models to use to apply the statistical analysis, and that was the problem.
I will say, I mean, from a data source standpoint, some of the use cases that we're being asked to, at least listen to and understand what those requirements are driving to is the pharma really driving towards the medical record data versus the clinical trial data, whether it's BT's UK history that's 35, 40 years old for a certain population, or current medical record services to try to get a broader picture of what's really happening from the clinician. So I think they're trying to reach out for more information. The modeling is probably a great point of, okay, how do we use that data as we grow it? But as you enable the framework and we start to make some of those other assets more available, then we'll start to, I think, be able to address those more affordably and start to work them into the real solution framework.
But if I may, Tom, I think this could be the case of be careful what you wish for. I mean, no, but serious. I mean, so the whole idea about outcomes being the predominant criteria, I get that. It's logical. But if that becomes the focus, it necessitates only the end point is looked at and not the process by which the patient is treated, then you have a problem. That's the point here, I think, that is being raised. So be careful about going down this route. And I think there's a great deal of market for us in terms of reimbursements, right? So potentially we have this bad outcome of statistics, of endpoints, versus model of process. I think that's an issue.
A corollary is the stuff that's going on with standardized testing in schools, where the teachers are teaching to the test, not teaching
Absolutely
the students.
True. Yes,
Right,
I can tell you in Massachusetts, that's a major issue with the MCAS. Yes, big problem, yes. Interesting. How much time do we have left? 7 minutes, okay, great. Does anybody in the audience have a question? I won't monopolize. No? Oh, I'm sorry.
How this where the FDA sits and if they're impeding progress or helping progress, doing
I
this
personally
data
think that my personal opinion is that they are years behind where the current technology is moving. And the problem with that is people are looking to them for guidance, but they really aren't in a position to make it because they really don't understand how this concept of socialization, where it's going to go. That's my personal opinion.
So how are we going to enable adaptive clinical trial design if the FDA is so far behind?
Well, it's not a question of can you enable it, because people are actually doing it. It's a question of will it be accepted, right? I mean, they're the gatekeepers, right? I mean, at the very end, right? So you have to convince them.
A lot of what I have heard about what's been going on with these multi-clinical studies is that they use it as the beginning of
Yes.
a new target or a
Right.
new drug, and then they go to the normal cycle of standard clinical practice to prove that that was actually
Right.
useful.
So-
That doesn't save a lot of time. That
Yeah.
saves some time,
Yes,
but
it's-
not a lot of time.
Right, but so what's happened now is going back to the very, very beginning of this panel was that you're trying to save the time in the portfolio decision making. You're trying to, so fast fail has become absolutely the mandate now. If I can kill your program any way I can, I'm going to do so. And I'll actually probably kill it, basically, even if it's a good program, just because in terms of a statistical analysis of where I ultimately will be for my entire portfolio, it will be better than if I wait too late, right? So, but that kind of blows back on you again. It's again, be careful what you wish for, because then what happens is you start killing a lot of really good programs, and you start decreasing the amount of risk that you're going to take as a company, right? So that flies in the face right now of where the industry is. The industry needs to take more risk because of the pipeline problems that it's in. So it's a completely opposing forces.
Just a couple of points. I mean, you talked about the FDA, but the EMEA is already developing pilots around adaptive licensing. So there are other regulators. The key issue is how they will pan out over the next couple of years, and what internationally all the regulators will do in terms of evaluating those as they pan out in Europe. So I think that's an issue as well, and there's some very large-scale approaches, I think, internationally through Europe to try and respond to that. I think what's clear is that, I mean, the gold standard, as it were, as clinical trials is under pressure. Is it going to be replaced? Well, no. But the key question is what can supplement it in terms of real-world evidence, observational data, and so forth. I mean, you were mentioning earlier about the clinical trial data. I mean, that's the problem is they're not real patients. You know, they are highly selected patients under a very, very strict protocol and very preset conditions who react to a drug in terms of safety, efficacy, and so forth. And then what we see in the real world could follow that, and we know sometimes disastrously it can't,
Yeah, they
particularly because of
self-select.
safety.
They self-select.
They self-select as well. So,
Yeah, that's true.
right.
That's right.
So you know, well, all medical students are learning all their pharmacology based on a 70-kilogram male. Yeah. So I mean, years ago I used to be one, but also just about the privacy and security. You mentioned a lot about the technology, but what you didn't mention is culture. And there's a lot of issues I mean, if you look at the hospital setting, certainly in my experience back in the UK in the National Health Service, it's just there was for years and still is, I think, an acceptance that there's almost a corporate right to information and data. And you know, we talk about electronic records. Paper records were shared all over the place and left out and lost, all sorts of things over the years. We always talk about security around IT, but security around paper records has been lousy for decades.
Right.
And we tend to think, oh, the new things come out and it's going to be worse and it's much more. It's scalable, and that's the problem. And more people probably can access it. But you also have to attack the culture. I mean, you try and enable security around electronic health record access, and it may be password mandate and so on. But how many clinics do you go into and there's a post-it note on the screen with the password?
It's true.
So there's a cultural, human issue that we have to address here.
Yeah.
And this is part of the problem, and we're facing it not just in terms of corporate or enterprise, but also in consumer. We're just drowning in passwords for all sorts of things, from our banking to Facebook to all sorts of things. And actually, there's a real issue, I think, just globally in terms of security, privacy, and confidentiality that has to be addressed.
So on that point, one thing that I do, I have a program called 1Password, and it's really cool. It just you have one really, really, really strong password, and you can use it on your phone and your computer, and it opens up a database of all your passwords, and they automatically link into the browser. So I go to exactly. Yeah. So you can. There are some solutions but it's not widely used though.
The thing is that most people do is constantly, every minute of the day, is they trade off security and privacy and so forth for convenience.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely
That's
true.
the key
Absolutely
issue.
true.
There's actually it was an informal study where they went on the street and they said, if I give you a chocolate bar, will you give me your password? Yeah, sure. Right? And about 50% of the people traded their password for a chocolate bar.
So I think part of the model and what we're we're proposing is to try to get down to that single credential, single identity. It means we need to connect those services so they all recognize that single credential, so that I really only have one that I have to remember, and I'm going to safeguard it because it provides access to so many things. It also gives me an audit history, whether I'm the organization that user works for or the service provider. I know who's coming. I know who's actually getting access to the data. I can really see that versus a whole, 10 different passwords for 10 different services. If I'm the organization security office, how do I manage that, right? It's much more difficult than to have that single credential and I start to tag it. As well as if you leave that organization and I take your password away, all of your access goes away, right? So I'm starting to improve that, the overall impact of the security risk, but also the usability. Give you one.
Right, and standards-based,
Right.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think the big data for our industry, from some of the project we work on, it's clearly here. One use case is a molecular epidemiology use case, right? So when we combine data in the medical history with some of the molecular level data, and when we scale up number of patients, subjects, then it's big data. And I also feel that security is just the first step. And we can solve that with some of non-technical solution. One example is a categorized data, right? Some data we simply keep it in using on-premise cloud solution, and others we bring up externally in a secure environment. And I think there's a problem with integration. How do we make sure that the data that we host externally, when we do integrate analysis with many applications in our environment, how do we do that in a very efficient way? And those are another problem. And I also feel that those are kind of problems that are truly going to be the next wave. How do we do the application in the very cloud computing architecture once we move beyond the security step?
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thanks, Tom, Lori, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, I just think I think that we had some solutions presented, but I think we had a lot of issues that we raised. But I think it's interesting because we're coming from very different perspectives. But clearly, it's interesting because it's not just the question of accessing the data, right? Or just bringing the data together. Clearly, it's much more than that. There are these ancillary issues that surround the actual practice, which clearly I don't think we have a complete handle on yet, either at the level of, say, the scientists or the regulators. So let's see how it goes. Let's meet back in a year and see what we've done.
I just wanted to end with one story.
Please.
To his point on the human problem with security, and that is a bank which had firewalls, all kinds of policies of security and rights management and everything, hired a company to see if they could crack into their systems. So what they did was they took a bunch of USB keys, threw them outside the front of the bank. Employees took the USB keys, oh, wonder what's on here. And they just Trojaned the whole entire internal system. Passwords were saved in web browsers, unencrypted, and they were able to get into pretty much a large portion of the infrastructure because the managers of the bank accessed this and it just sent all that data right out the bank. So it really is a social problem. It's not just a technical problem.
Go ahead.
Much of the technology has now moved beyond USB or smart card to using your mobile device or lots of different mobile devices. It's highly mobile.
And that's even scarier, right?
No,
because
I think
you can Trojan those much easier.
People with USB key on the street, but they receive something. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I could say just a small, very quick story. So back in the 2000 days, we actually, for our company, which the Hotchkiss company, we had actually hired the former NSA lead. This is a guy who was a colonel from the Army, real crusty old guy, came in, gave a discussion. I just remember vividly, years later, remember him going through all the different layers of security, and at the bottom line, he just basically put up this big smiley face as this last slide, and he said, the big problem with security is you just can't get rid of the people. I just remember that. Yeah. So,
Thanks.